When The Dark Knight arrived in July of 2008, it quickly became one of the highest-grossing films ever made. Most audiences saw a studio tentpole. Wall Street saw a portfolio asset performing ahead of projections. There's a fundamental question about this era almost nobody thought to ask. Whose money was actually at risk? Tucked behind the Warner Brothers logo was a financing arrangement the public was never meant to hear about. In 2005, Legendary Pictures signed a co-financing deal with Warner Brothers covering roughly 40 films over 7 years, including Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and Inception. But the capital didn't belong to Legendary. It came from institutional investors like Abri Partners, AIG Direct Investments, and Bank of America Capital Investors. Private equity money, sitting quietly behind the most recognizable logos in the world. The studio provided the infrastructure, the distribution network, and the brand. The outside investors absorbed the risk. That arrangement was documented in trade publications, but it was never part of the public narrative. The story the world cared about was always Batman, not the hedge funds in the background. That gap between what audiences see and who holds the financial leverage is exactly what we are going to investigate today. In the early 2000s, studios faced pressure from corporate parents who wanted consistent profits but feared the unpredictable movie business. Wall Street was hunting for new asset classes. These two worlds found each other, and the Slate financing deal became their primary tool. In a typical Slate deal, an outside fund covers roughly half the production costs. The studio takes a distribution fee off the top, usually between 20 and 30%, before any investor sees a cent. Then the studio recoups its marketing spend. Only then do outside investors participate in whatever remains. The studio is insulated at every level. The outside investor carries the majority of the risk. Relativity Media extended this logic by securing a credit line of approximately $1 billion from Elliott Management, a distressed debt hedge fund. Wall Street was treating movies as a cold asset class. Films were collateral, and the only variable that mattered was the return on the debt. The MGM bankruptcy in 2010 represents the extreme end. Hedge funds had bought MGM's debt at a steep discount, and when that debt converted to equity, the creditors became the creative institution itself. They did not arrive because they loved cinema. They arrived because the math worked. Individual films were routinely structured as standalone companies, registered in favorable jurisdictions to access tax incentives and secure loans against future distribution revenues. The film was legally owned by a shell company. The real investors sat behind a chain of holding companies the public was never meant to trace. This is the shadow bank, not a conspiracy, but a collection of legal instruments. Slate deals, offshore entities, special purpose vehicles that systematically move risk away from studios while keeping the source of the capital invisible. When you hide where the money comes from, you also hide who is responsible for how it is used. That is why the public relations firewall matters so much to the system. The shadow bank requires one thing above all else to function: invisibility. In an industry built entirely on publicity, staying hidden requires constant and active management. We can call this protective layer the PR firewall. It is not a conspiracy between editors and studio executives. It is a set of institutional incentives that produce soft coverage as a natural outcome without anyone issuing a direct order. Trade publications like Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, and Deadline depend on studio access to produce the content their readers pay for. Studios and financiers depend on favorable coverage to signal credibility to investors. Because each party has exactly what the other needs, adversarial reporting on money is rare. When the trade press covered the Slate deal wave, announcements were framed as innovative financing or bold new partnerships. The actual mechanics, the waterfall structures, the distribution fees, the offshore entities, were almost never discussed. Reputation management firms complete the architecture. They place favorable stories, build philanthropic associations, and dilute negative reporting before it reaches critical mass. Scrutiny only arrives when a scandal becomes legally unavoidable. By that point, the capital has already moved. The PR firewall did not create the shadow bank, but it is the primary reason the shadow bank operates without interruption. If this kind of forensic investigation is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel. The next chapter is where the mechanics become a case study, and the case study is not a comfortable one. For the purposes of this investigation, Jeffrey Epstein is not a tabloid story. He is a forensic case study in how institutions confer respectability in exchange for money and proximity, and how long that exchange can persist after serious allegations become a matter of public record. In 2000, Epstein established the Jeffrey Epstein VI Foundation in the United States Virgin Islands. He directed money towards scientific and academic institutions with a consistency that was clearly strategic. Harvard's program for evolutionary dynamics received pledges totaling $30 million, though the amount actually delivered was closer to $6.5 million. Geneticist George Church received funding between 2005 and 2007. Donations reached the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab through its director, Joy Ito. These payments continued after Epstein's 2008 conviction for soliciting a minor. What those institutions received was not just capital, it was association. A donation of sufficient size produces an invitation. That invitation produces a photograph. That photograph appears in a society column, and the cycle begins again. Raw money is converted into something that looks like earned legitimacy. Each institution could claim limited knowledge of what the others were doing, so no single organization had to confront the full picture. After his release, Epstein retained Mary Spaeth, a former Reagan administration media director, to manage his image. She coached him on language designed to deflect without conceding ground and drafted apology letters he never issued. This was not improvised damage control. It was a professional operation using the same tools reputation firms deploy for corporate clients under regulatory scrutiny. The horror of the Epstein case is not that the system was corrupted. It is that the system functioned exactly as it was designed to. The Epstein case was never an anomaly that drifted into the entertainment world from the outside. The methods he used, charity work for cover, elite social circles for access, are the exact same tools Hollywood's financial world uses to stay hidden. This is not a theory, it is a matter of public record. Documents released by the Department of Justice, including Epstein's own calendars and emails, show scheduled meetings with producers and high-level media executives. One notable name in those files is Casey Wasserman, founder of a major talent agency and chair of the organizing committee for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. That link is documented fact, and it illustrates how the lines between different concentrations of power routinely blur. The social infrastructure of the wealthy functions as a single ecosystem. When the same people sit at the same dinner tables and serve on the same charity boards, legitimacy in one area transfers directly to another. A reputation built in finance follows a person into a film studio or a media headquarters without anyone having to formally endorse the transfer. The rise and fall of Relativity Media makes this visible. For years, the trade press praised Relativity as the most innovative company in the industry. The crushing debt held by Elliott Management was rarely mentioned. When Relativity filed for bankruptcy in 2015, the gap between its public image and its financial reality could no longer be held. The public relations wall had stayed up just long enough for the capital to move. The shadow bank and the PR machine are not separate operations. They lean on each other to survive. In most major film deals, the studio logo on screen is the least important name involved. The people who hold the real leverage are the creditors and outside investment funds the general audience never hears about. The industry is built to keep those names in the dark, and that is not an accident. It is a structural feature. This system survives not because a few villains are protecting it, but because every player is looking out for their own interests. Studios, reporters, and reputation managers all benefit when the money stays invisible and the stars stay in the spotlight. Their incentives align naturally around keeping the public from looking too closely at where the capital comes from. The Epstein case did not reveal a failure in this system. It revealed how well the system protects itself, even when the truth is in plain sight. If you want to understand how Hollywood really functions, the studio logo is the last place to look. If you want to see more investigations like this one, subscribe to the channel.